Hello and welcome to Building a Crisis, an intensive investigation on housing in Canada. We hope you enjoy listening, and we ask you to please subscribe, share, but most of all, go review the podcast with 5 stars. We're trying to affect as many people as possible with this podcast, and reviewing us will increase our chances of being viewed in the algorithm. For more excellent investigations, please visit therover.ca, and you can also check out Gabrielle and mine's work over at duoduet.substack.com. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
We interviewed a lot of experts and spent months on this, mainly focusing on Quebec, but the reality is, this applies to every single place in North America. Véronique Laflamme said it best.
Je dirais d'abord un mot sur l'ensemble du Québec, puisque c'est un regroupement provincial.
Well, first I'd say a word on the entirety of Quebec, since we're a provincial organization. The housing crisis that we're in right now is probably the longest lasting in modern Quebec history. We're experiencing it as a kind of generalized shortage. There were housing crises at the beginning of the 2000s, at the beginning of the 2010s, that hit Montreal, Quebec City, Gatineau, Sherbrooke. They were significant periods of housing shortages, but ones that only affected the major urban centers. Right now, every town and city in Quebec is experiencing a vacancy rate of 3% or less.
The idea started back in the summer 2024. AJIQ got wind of a protest in Verdun about a woman who was evicted from her apartment during the peak of COVID. The landlord apparently told her it was so his family could move in. Instead, it became an Airbnb that was pulling in $3,000 a month.
Donc, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé avec l'appartement et toi?
So, what happened between the apartment and you? Well, I moved in 2010. I got a notice that the house was sold. The man who bought it asked that we would leave, myself and my upstairs neighbors, because he said that he would be living in the apartment. So we moved, but afterwards we discovered that the gentleman never lived there and rented it out as an Airbnb. For me, it was a huge injustice, and I got through it, but I don't want my friends and family to experience something similar. So for me, I think there needs to be laws that will stop it from happening again. Yes, my daughter is 18 years old. Back then, she was 14 years old when the gentleman asked us to leave the house. Now she's 18. Today she's working, so she couldn't come to the protest.
Pendant la pandémie?
C'était pendant le Covid, exactement, en 2020, et moi je travaillais dans la santé.
Yes, exactly. It was during COVID. I work for the health system, so at the time it was extremely stressful. Not only that, but she was full teenager at the time. So it was a big deal for me to manage all of these things at the same time. I was very lucky. I started looking and I found something in the neighborhood. And it's not everyone who's going to be that lucky. I couldn't leave the neighborhood. My work is here. My daughter's school is just next to us.
In Montreal, Verdun is the center of the housing crisis. It's gotten to the point where the area feels more like a borough full of Airbnb than a neighborhood.
Bonjour.
Hello. What is your name? Mary Frederick St. Ange. I'm the coordinator of the Verdun Housing Committee. So why is there a protest here in Verdun today? We learned that there was a single parent who had to leave her apartment after living there for 10 years. She was a victim of an unjust eviction. And today it is an Airbnb making more than $3,500 a month. It's a pattern that we see a lot of Airbnbs being established here in Verdun. So this protest was to show the neighborhood and to show the government that we are not happy with how things are going, that there needs to be laws instituted, specifically around Airbnbs, or a complete banning of Airbnbs in general. Verdun is very specifically being hit by gentrification due to short-term rentals. People just don't move here anymore. It's important that we put people before profit. We have about 15 to 19% inflation on housing prices per year. That is a huge raise, and we noticed that in the last statistics released by the Government of Canada, we lost a ton of people who couldn't afford to live here, so we lost about 6,000 families from this neighborhood. These families were replaced by families that make more than $120,000 a year. It's an aberration, but Verdun was created by and for the working class. It's frustrating because this area was traditionally able to be welcoming for those who were lower class or working class. Now there are almost no socialized housings in this area, as well as a huge amount of new buildings that are increasing the prices. It's happening everywhere in Montreal that places are being gentrified, and it's happening all over Quebec in general. Speculators and landlords don't really have any geographical limits, but even still, some neighborhoods have been hit worse than the others.
But in reality, it's bad everywhere. There are two worlds. We have the world of those who are able to comfortably afford their places. Then we have the majority of folks who are being swallowed by the cost of living. A few years back, just before the COVID pandemic, it was clear that the crisis was already heating up, with many people already saying that it was a housing crisis. Meanwhile, the government had yet to acknowledge this. The price of purchasing a house in Canada doubled between 2010 and 2020, going from around $300,000 to almost $550,000. In half that time, the average price of housing in Canada has increased by another $200,000.
Meanwhile, rent has nearly doubled since 2010, going from an average of $806 to $1,402 across Canada. In Montreal, the rent in October 2009 was an average of $609 per month, with it now being $1,167 a month on average. Quebec as a whole has an average rent of $1,119, having nearly doubled in the past 10 years. Many age-old ideas are being debunked in the modern age, no longer having any poignancy. It used to be that if you didn't want to pay the price for a city apartment, just move outside the city. Now this wisdom rings hollow, since rents outside the city are hardly less expensive and virtually impossible to find. People have touted this being due to immigration, but if even places like Rimouski and Shawinigan are hard to find affordable rent, is it really due to immigration?
There's a major shortage everywhere in Quebec. We have to be careful. With that said, this crisis isn't just about scarcity, it's about affordability. The price of rent has increased in an extremely fast way, especially in municipalities where scarcity has been a problem for years. We're seeing the price of rent go up in a straight line in cities where we thought this would never happen. I'm thinking of cities like Rimouski, Drummondville, Granby, Sherbrooke. You look at the situation in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, that's deteriorating rapidly. In Quebec City as well, for the first time in its history, the average rent went over $1,000 per month. But when we look at the price of rental units that are available, it's unheard of. In Quebec, as in Montreal, as in Gatineau, there are families looking for affordable rent. They see a 3-bedroom unit going for over $2,000. So unaffordability becomes even more difficult. So there are available units, it's just that the ones that are available are extremely expensive. Or the few ones that are affordable are in a state that is unacceptable. So that creates this immense pressure on renters, regardless of whether they have no financial security or some financial security, who wind up having to pay up to 80% of their revenue for rent.
The crisis is about inaffordability and not about immigration. Immigration has increased pressure on the system, but it is not the fault of those who've arrived within the past 5-10 years that for 40-45 years, Canada has not been preparing for more people to come to the country. It is not the fault of people who just arrived that for 45 years there have been cuts to the budgets of constructing places for people to live.
Cities have less than 1% available housing to rent, and smaller municipalities have less than 0.5%. Prices keep on rising, with no laws to protect tenants being implemented. In fact, in Quebec, laws have been actively changed to benefit landlords. The CAQ government passed a bill that limited lease transfers called Bill 31. It passed in 2022 among mass protests and significant unpopularity. Particularly since the pandemic, the cost of living has increased 17.5% from 2020 to 2025. The highest peak annually that Canada experienced during the post-pandemic period was almost 9%, where in the Great Depression it hit an all-time high of 20%. During the global recession of 2007, the cost of living only increased by 3 to 4%. Meanwhile, it was considered a global economic crisis. For years, the government refused to acknowledge that there was a crisis, saying on the government official website that for all of 2024, inflation has been within the Bank of Canada's target range and price stability has been restored across most sectors, which to anyone who is still conscious of income rings extremely hollow.
So, when did this start? The conversation became heated during COVID, but people were already discussing it in 2010. But prior to that is when experts say it truly began. Across a wide berth of experts, all of them said it began in the late 80s and 90s under austerity measures with Brian Mulroney and the Chrétien governments. Jean-Philippe Meloche, an urbanist and professor at Université de Montréal, spoke to us about the crisis and its genesis.
Certainly, throughout history, there have been periods of economic stagnation. There's people looking for a home, and there's people who want to build or manage or own a rental unit. But sometimes there can be a high demand and not enough supply, and that's where we have to catch up. Economists might say the market runs itself. So if demand increases and we haven't built more homes, then prices are going up. So when prices go up, it will make people want to build more houses because they can sell them for more. Usually the markets are slow to react. So you can build and build and build, and then finally maybe you've built too much and prices come way down. Also, population and household size are not the same thing. It's the makeup of our households that creates demand for housing. So you can actually have a larger population and less demand for housing because that population is more families. So you might have 2 parents and 3 kids, and that's 5 people in one unit. But when it's not families and the population is just aging, for example, and now we're currently in an aging and wealthier population, so those 2 factors generate a new situation where people want to live alone. Why? Because they don't have kids, or they don't want to have kids, or they had kids and they don't have kids anymore because the population is aging. That's a factor that explains that. The growth of wealth is another factor. So the wealthier I am, the more space I want to own. It's banal. The more I have, the more I want. Housing follows that logic. So if we have the same housing stock and everyone's getting richer, what are they going to do? So they're going to take the same houses as before and just put fewer people in it. I'll give you the example of Le Plateau Mont-Royal. The population of the borough in 1976, it's about 170,000 people. Today, there are about 100,000. So anyone who sees this will say, wow, it's going really bad on the Plateau Mont-Royal. Houses must be boarded up, people must have gone, people must have fled. But houses have never been more expensive than they are now. It's just the change in demographics. In the 1960s, there were families, modest families, with several people in every unit. Today, to be able to have a good standard of living, you can only have 2 people in a house. So the fact that people on the plateau are a lot richer today than they used to be It's created a situation where you have fewer people occupying the same space. But all the people no longer living there, well, we had to build housing elsewhere. That's what's created demand for more housing. The aging population that's created more demand, but also the concentration of wealth. It explains why people are living the way they're living. That poses two problems, and it's important to distinguish. Are there enough units for everyone? And do we have housing for the poor? And it's not the same issue necessarily. One of them is just the question of mathematics. I've got 10 families, I need 10 houses. If there are 9 houses for 10 families, you end up with a family on the street. They're going to fight for their housing, they're going to end up in a situation where they have to live with others and they won't be happy. And now, in that population, there are richer people and there are poorer people. Every society in the world has that dynamic. And there's a sort of distribution of that wealth. Usually, the biggest chunk of that distribution is in the middle, what we call the middle class. A society that spreads that wealth out evenly should have not too many rich people and not too many poor people. A society with more inequality will have a tighter middle, a lot more poor people, and a lot more rich people. All depending on how that inequality is spread out. If we let the market go unchecked, we're just going to end up in a situation where people are living in shacks on the street. They don't have money to house themselves, so they'll find a way to squat, or they'll find materials, soft materials like a tarp, or slightly harder materials like wood. They'll just make something and live in it. Gentrification is a particular context. And even with experts, we can debate what is gentrification. But for me, gentrification is, well, you start with a popular neighborhood. Often it's neighborhoods that were historically working class. The people born in these neighborhoods, sometimes they'll stay for a little bit of time, sometimes they'll stay even longer, because these transformations don't happen overnight. But then the question you have to ask yourself is, well, where did those modest income families go? If they disappeared because they got richer and moved somewhere else, then that's okay. But if that's not the case, and they've been displaced or pushed further out of the center of the city, well, then we'll say gentrification is a bad thing. Or at least this should cause us to think about our policies. So where were these people moved to? How are they living right now? The agent of gentrification, what I call the agent of gentrification, is the person who creates it by choosing to move into the neighborhood. Has this person caused harm by displacing others and diminishing their quality of life?
The problem started a long time ago, but with investments and divestments, people don't see the effect until much later. It's not a political winner to embark on 10, 20-year projects. Often, governments won't rely on major investments because they don't win short-term votes. Big budgets that will save money long-term don't win elections. The Conservatives win off of the idea of balancing the budget, which is popular among the right wing. It's interesting to note that this expert in housing, a professor at the University of Montreal, believes that there isn't yet a crisis. We found that to be curious.
The most obvious and visible sign of the crisis is homelessness. In 4 years, the homeless population in Canada doubled. Homelessness is caused by affordability and availability of housing before anything else, as attested to by the Government of Canada itself. We interviewed David Chapman, the director of Resilience Montreal, and had a long conversation about the current state of homelessness.
There's a dark side to humanity, and regardless of how you package it, it's very present. Unfortunately, I'm aware of its consequences because this is not my first rodeo trying to start a homeless center. I've been blocked before. I've had neighbors kick me out of a neighborhood before. I'm very aware of what happens when you get it wrong and what the neighbors can do to you, okay? I used to run a center called the Open Door 2 blocks away from here, and wealthy Westmount neighbors eventually made enough complaints to the mayor of Westmount. And so there's pressure on Westmount to move the resource out of town. We found another potential site, which was, I looked at 40 buildings over a 2-year period of time. I found, eventually, it was this little black Pentecostal church that was willing to rent. So ironic, because I went everywhere else, and in the end, it's this little conservative little church that's actually willing, to rent space. And all the lovely lefties who should have been helpful were looking out for themselves, okay? This is the other thing you find out, all right? The person who might fuck you the most is the human rights professor. Anyway, this little black Pentecostal church was willing to rent to us. We were in the process of signing a lease. The house neighbors found out about it. They presented a petition to the local city council, who then rejected our ability to continue on and sign that lease. They told us, look, we're not going to give you a permit to operate here. The Open Door had to accept taking a property that was like more than 2 kilometers away across the city, which we explained was going to be a big problem because a lot of people weren't going to move and there was going to be consequences to that. After the Open Door moved to the plateau, which was December 1st, 2018, it was clear that a good percentage, at least 50% of the people around Cabot Square area weren't moving to the new site, and in fact were in more desperate conditions around Cabot Square. All of a sudden there was an awareness at the level of the city of Montreal that, oops, we made a mistake here. The problems around Cabot Square only multiplied. People who were unhoused around Cabot Square were in more desperate circumstances. They were eating less, sleeping less, they less access to clean clothes and a shower. Basically, they were more miserable, and as a result, they were using more. And then we were seeing a spike in early deaths among the homeless population. It became really clear that our worst fears were being realized. This is the space that we're in now at 4000 St. Catherine. I would go and every few times a week, I'd go and meet with the unhoused in Cabot Square Park, and I'd bring a bag of burgers, chicken burgers on the one hand, cheeseburgers on the other, and I'd pass them out and I'd talk with people, about what they wanted in the next, homeless resource in the neighborhood. And we'd make little jokes like, what about that building right over there, guys? What do you think? Maybe we go for that one? And they're, oh yeah, that's funny, And, but in the end, that's exactly what we did. And we got it. The rent was initially basically what we're paying now, which is like $20,000 a month. So we have big bills, but it isn't cheap to run a homeless center in Montreal. Any land you find anywhere is expensive, and you're not in a position where you can bargain. They don't really want you renting the land anyway. It's interesting because I've been invited to these Future of Westmount meetings, which are interested in, I can show you later the website that's inviting me, and but it's basically developing the east side of Westmount. They're making plans at the moment for the development of this region along Atwater, just west of Atwater, and I went to one of these meetings, and what was so interesting was that there's about 30 people in the room, and literally half of them are condo developers. It's funny because the condo developers seem to have a different, view of this green space than the person who runs the library, And so it seems pretty clear, where the priorities are in Westmount. It's sad because it is an area where they have actually, they're one of the wealthiest cities in all of Canada, and they have the greatest means of helping a problem, and yet they have the smallest will to do it. It makes the situation so much harder for the surrounding boroughs that are just, trying to implement basic services that people need. And now, because of Westmount's refusal to really engage in homelessness, the surrounding boroughs end up with a lot more work to do because, the unhoused find themselves quickly hassled in Westmount. And that will continue as the new condos go up. And then what happens is they move to the surrounding areas, and now the boroughs, they find themselves in a situation where now they have a higher concentration of the unhoused because there's a borough next to them with great means and with a really pitiful sense of social responsibility. One of the debates that happens in the field of homelessness is, what's the balance between, emergency services, like shelters, for example, and various models of housing, like various versions of subsidized housing. And at the end of the day, you need both. Right now, at the moment, the Housing First movement has a fair bit of steam in Canada and North America. And while it is, I think, somewhat effective with the sort of, you could say, the more functional of the unhoused population, for those with more challenges, especially racialized minorities, it can be a disaster because the model encourages housing and rehousing if something goes wrong. And what happens is landlords talk, and before long they share videos of, look what happened with this Inuit person in my building. They were, intoxicated while talking on the phone in the corridor, punching somebody out, and they go show to the next landlord, and before long, Inuit can't rent anywhere. No matter how you set up the housing, it takes a while for people to get into the housing, okay? And if you do not have viable alternatives in the meantime that help keep people alive, where basic needs can be met, a little bit of rest, a little bit of food, a place to take a shower, get some clean clothes. If you don't also have those emergency services, a safe injection site where, you can actually use your drugs and, if someone's there with naloxone just in case, while these services are often criticized because they're more expensive, and yet the thing is, dead people don't go into housing, and so this is the point I like to repeat because it frequently doesn't get through. Yes, housing is important, and yes, it's important to fund housing, and at the same time, it's irresponsible to take funding out of emergency services so as to stick it in housing, which is what we see sometimes in Quebec, okay? And so at the end of the day, you need both. You need a place where people can be kept alive while they wait for housing and long-term support. And you also need those housing options as well.
The crisis is in full effect. We know for a fact that things aren't looking good, but that's just the beginning of understanding the crisis. Next week, we'll be back with some of the top researchers on the housing crisis. We'll be talking to Marie-Josée Hull, the federal housing advocate, and François Cortellini from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Until next week.
Thank you for joining us. Please go review us, and please go share this with your friends. Check out therover.ca as well as duoduet.substack.com.